It is the early hours of September 17th, 1944, and the sky above the flat farmland near Arnhem is filled with silk. Thousands of parachutes drift down over the Dutch polders, carrying men of the British 1st Airborne Division into what will become one of the most desperate battles of the war. Among the canopies fall dozens of long cylindrical containers, tumbling end over end before snapping open beneath their own chutes. Packed inside one of these containers, wedged between ammunition boxes and medical supplies, sits something that looks almost like a child's toy, a motorcycle so small it could be mistaken for a fairground ride. A soldier reaches the container, hauls it open, and pulls a small ring at the base of the handlebars. In a matter of seconds, 11, according to the men who tested it under stopwatch conditions, the machine unfolds itself. The seat telescopes upward. The handlebars snap into place. He kicks the starter, and a sound like an angry sewing machine fills the air. Moments later, he is away across the fields, weaving between hedgerows, the little engine rising and falling in pitch as he goes. This is the Welbike, at 32 kilograms, the smallest motorcycle ever issued to the British Armed Forces, and one of the stranger products of a secret war fought as much with ideas as with bullets. It was built to answer a question that on paper sounds almost absurd. How do you give a man who has just jumped out of an airplane, carrying nothing but what fits on his back, the ability to move as fast as a vehicle? And it was not designed by a major arms manufacturer at all, but inside a requisitioned country house in Hertfordshire, by a small team whose job was to dream up the tools of sabotage, escape, and resistance. What follows is the story of that machine, how it came to be built, how it was meant to be used, and the murkier, more fascinating question of what actually happened to it once it reached occupied Europe. Because behind the cheerful image of a folding motorbike popping out of a parachute container lies one of the odder chapters of Britain's secret war. An attempt to give resistance fighters and airborne soldiers alike the one thing that, until then, had been impossible to drop from the sky. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood largely alone. France had fallen in June. The Low Countries were under occupation, and Winston Churchill had ordered the creation of a new organization with an instruction that has since become famous: to set Europe ablaze. That organization was the Special Operations Executive, formed in July 1940 and tasked with espionage, sabotage, and the support of resistance movements across occupied Europe and, later, Asia. At almost the same time, military planners in London were studying a very different operation unfolding in the Mediterranean. In May 1941, German paratroopers seized the island of Crete in a bold and costly airborne assault. The operation succeeded, but German casualties were so severe that further large-scale airborne attacks were quietly shelved. British observers drew their own lesson from this. The danger to paratroopers was not the jump itself, but the minutes and hours afterwards, when men were scattered across unfamiliar ground, often kilometers from their objective, with no way of covering distance except on foot. By the middle of the war, the scale of this effort had grown considerably. SOE's French section alone sent something in the order of 470 agents into the country between 1941 and 1944. Each one reliant on local resistance networks for shelter, transport, and support once on the ground. Multiply that by similar networks across Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and elsewhere, and the scale of the mobility problem becomes clear. Hundreds of individuals scattered across enemy territory, all facing the same basic difficulty of getting from where they landed to where they needed to be. For the Special Operations Executive, the problem was even sharper. An agent dropped into occupied France might land many kilometers from the nearest safe house, the nearest resistance contact, or the target of a planned act of sabotage: a railway junction, a fuel depot, a wireless transmitter. Every minute spent trudging across open countryside in the dark was a minute of exposure to German patrols, checkpoints, and curious neighbors who might report a stranger. Existing solutions simply did not fit the problem. A standard Army motorcycle weighed well over 100 kilograms and was far too large for any parachute container then in service. Bicycles could be dropped, and were, but they were slow and exhausting over distance, offering little real advantage over a fit man on foot for anything beyond a few kilometers. What was needed was something that combined the portability of a folded bicycle with the speed of a powered vehicle, and that could survive being thrown out of an aircraft packed inside a tube barely wider than. The dimensions were the real tyranny of the problem. The standard supply container used by the RAF for parachute drops, known as the Canister Light Equipment or CLE container, measured roughly 130 centimeters long, 38 centimeters high, and 30 centimeters wide, 51 by 15 by 12 inches. Anything that hoped to travel inside one had to fold down in its packed state to something smaller than a rolled-up hearthrug. No motorcycle in production anywhere in the world came close. To build one that did would mean stripping away almost everything that, until then, had defined what a motorcycle was. The task fell to Station 9, the cover designation for SOE's Research and Development Establishment, based at a requisitioned mansion called the Frythe, near the village of Welwyn in Hertfordshire, and disguised to the outside world as the Inter-Services Research Bureau. To anyone passing by, it looked like a quiet corner of the countryside doing unspecified war work. In reality, it was where some of the conflict's strangest and most ingenious gadgets were dreamed up. Silenced pistols, sabotage devices hidden inside everyday objects, and, under the direction of the station's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Dolphin, a tiny, folding motorcycle that would take its name from the place that built it, the Welbike, from Welwyn. The prototype was the work of Harry Lester, an SOE engineer and keen motorcyclist, developing an idea sketched out by Dolphin himself. Their solution was almost brutally simple. Take a motorcycle and remove everything not strictly necessary to make it move. There would be no suspension, so the rider's own body would absorb the bumps. There would be no lights, since the machine was meant to operate in darkness or to be abandoned after a single use. There would be just one brake. The frame was built from twin loops of tubular steel, light enough to lift with one hand, with handlebars that folded flat against the body, and a seat mounted on a telescopic tube that could be pushed almost flush with the frame for packing. Power came from a 98 cubic centimeters Villiers engine, a two-stroke single-cylinder unit more commonly found in gentle civilian autocycles, the sort of unassuming machine an office clerk might use for the commute to work. It produced perhaps 1.5 horsepower, roughly the output of a modern petrol lawnmower, driving the rear wheel through a single-speed gearbox. There was no conventional kickstart either. Like an autocycle, the engine was started by pedaling, the rider's legs doing the job a starter motor would do on a larger bike. The fuel tank held just 3.7 liters, about 6.5 pints, roughly the contents of a large vacuum flask. Because the tank sat low on the frame, below the level of the carburetor, petrol would not reach the engine by gravity alone. Before use, the rider had to work a small hand pump to pressurize the tank and force fuel upward. A fiddly, slightly comical solution, but one that let the tank occupy the lowest, most compact part of the design. Engineers at Station 9 tested the prototype repeatedly on the grounds of the Frythe itself, refining the folding mechanism until it became second nature even to soldiers who had never seen the machine before. The same workshops that produced the Welbike were, at various points, also responsible for devices ranging from exploding fountain pens to miniature cameras hidden inside cigarette lighters. A reminder that, for the men and women of Station 9, building a motorcycle that fitted inside a dustbin-sized tube was simply another problem to be solved with the same blend of improvisation and precision. The complete machine, dry, weighed 32 kilograms, about the weight of a heavy suitcase packed for a fortnight away or a large adult dog. Folded down, it slid into the CLE container alongside other stores, ready to be dropped by parachute or carried in by glider. In repeated trials, soldiers found they could haul a Welbike from its container, unfold it, and have the engine running in as little as 11 seconds. Manufacture was handed to the Excelsior Motor Company, based on Kings Road in Tyseley, Birmingham, a long-established maker of bicycles and motorcycles that, like much of British industry, had spent the early war years on contract engineering for the services rather than building anything of its own. The first production order, dated August 26, 1942, called for 1,000 machines, later increased to 1,200, with frame numbers running from 14 through to 1,214. Further contracts followed through 1942 and into 1943. As with much SOE material, exact totals are difficult to pin down with certainty, but the most widely cited figure is around 3,641 production machines, plus a prototype and a handful of pilot models tested separately at the Airborne Forces Experimental Establishment near Leeds, including trials of dropping them from aircraft to land by parachute. On paper, the Welbike's purpose was clear. Alongside other Station 9 inventions, the Welrod, a near-silent pistol designed for close-quarters work, and the Welgun, a compact folding submachine gun, it was meant to be part of the same family of tools. Equipment parachuted to resistance circuits in France, Norway, and elsewhere to give agents and local fighters a fast, disposable way of reaching a target, striking it, and disappearing again before German patrols could react. A man might use one to reach an arms dump, a railway siding, or a rendezvous with a weapons drop, then leave the machine behind. Expendable, untraceable, its job done. How often that actually happened is far harder to say. SOE's operational paperwork remains patchy at best. Much was deliberately destroyed after the war, other material remains classified or has simply been lost, and the day-to-day records of individual resistance circuits rarely survive in enough detail to confirm whether a particular supply drop included a Welbike, let alone whether one was ridden on a specific raid against a German depot or convoy. What can be said with confidence is that Welbikes were packed into containers bound for occupied Europe alongside weapons and explosives intended for resistance use. But the machine's reputation within SOE itself was lukewarm. Internal assessments noted that it was noisy, conspicuous, thirsty for scarce petrol, and poor on anything other than a firm track or road, hardly the ideal qualities for a getaway vehicle in the lanes and fields of occupied France. If you're finding this story interesting so far, a quick subscribe really does help the channel more than you might think, and there is plenty more to come, so do stick around. Where the Welbike's use is much better documented is with conventional military formations rather than clandestine ones. Examples were issued to the British 1st and 6th Airborne Divisions, and a number went ashore with Royal Marine Commandos on the Normandy beaches on D-Day in June 1944, giving small reconnaissance and liaison parties a way to move quickly inland from the landing zones. At Arnhem that September, men of the 1st Airborne Division used them for exactly the kind of short dash described at the start of this story, covering ground between scattered drop zones and assembly points in the chaotic opening hours of Operation Market Garden, before the battle for the bridge collapsed into the grinding stalemate for which it is now remembered. The wider picture of supply drops to resistance circuits gives some sense of just how much material was moving through the night skies of occupied Europe by 1944. Operations mounted in support of the French resistance that summer could each involve hundreds of aircraft dropping thousands of containers in a single night, enough in some individual operations to equip an estimated 20,000 fighters. Against that backdrop, a few hundred folding motorcycles packed among countless containers of rifles, explosives, and ammunition were a small part of a much larger logistical effort. One more piece of equipment dropped into the dark, with no guarantee of how or whether it would ever be used. Britain was not alone in wrestling with this problem, though its solutions diverged sharply from those of its allies and enemies. The United States fielded the Cushman Model 53 Airborne, a sturdy little scooter built around a four-stroke engine and issued to American paratroopers in Europe and the Pacific. It was a genuinely useful machine, but at around 100 kilograms, more than 3 times the Welbike's weight, it represented a different design philosophy altogether, rugged and durable rather than minimal and disposable. Germany's closest equivalent in spirit, if not in scale, was the Kettenkrad, a half-tracked motorcycle weighing well over half a ton, designed to tow light guns and equipment for paratroopers rather than to be dropped alongside them. It shared the Welbike's airborne connection, but almost nothing else. Where the British machine was built to be thrown away after a single dash across a field, the Kettenkrad was a serious piece of military hardware, built to last and to do real work. The contrast says a great deal about the two approaches to the same problem. One nation building something expendable enough to drop from the sky in a cardboard tube, the other building something heavy enough to need its own delivery by glider. Italian airborne units, for their part, generally relied on folding bicycles rather than powered transport, a simpler and cheaper answer that sacrificed speed for reliability. Germany, whose own airborne operations had prompted British planners to take the mobility problem seriously in the first place, never produced a true equivalent. What little is recorded of similar experiments in the German military suggests nothing reached the same combination of size, weight, and parachute readiness as the Welbike. Of the major combatants, only Britain built a powered vehicle small enough to be considered, in the truest sense, disposable. Assessing the Welbike's actual impact on the war is not straightforward, and honesty demands a degree of caution. In purely material terms, it changed very little. No battle was won or lost because of it, and its mechanical shortcomings, the noise, the thirst for fuel, the difficulty on rough ground, were real and were noted at the time by the very organization that had commissioned it. Its significance lies less in what it achieved on the ground and more in what it represented. An entire engineering philosophy built around the idea that a weapon, a tool, or a vehicle need not be built to last, only to work, once, when it mattered. That philosophy outlived the war in an unexpected way. After 1945, Excelsior adapted the Welbike's basic layout, small wheels, a compact frame, a simple engine, into the Corgi, a civilian scooter sold cheaply to demobilized servicemen looking for affordable transport in the difficult years that followed. The Corgi sold in respectable numbers through the late 1940s. Its folding frame and tiny engine marketed not as relics of secret warfare, but as cheerful, affordable runabouts. Proof that even the strangest wartime inventions could find an afterlife once the shooting stopped. A machine designed to be parachuted behind enemy lines and abandoned ended up, in modified form, getting clerks and laborers to work on Monday mornings. A handful of original Welbikes survive today in museum collections, including the RAF Museum at Cosford and the Imperial War Museum's airborne collections, with at least one example held overseas at the Estrella Warbird Museum in California. Small, slightly forlorn-looking machines, often displayed alongside the very parachute containers they were designed to travel in. Surviving examples are now rare enough to attract serious interest whenever one appears at auction, with unrestored machines, complete with their original parachute containers, fetching several £1,000s from collectors drawn to a piece of equipment that occupies such an odd corner of military history. Too impractical to be remembered as a great weapon, too ingenious to be forgotten entirely. So return for a moment to that field near Arnhem in the chaos of September 1944. The container has split open. The little machine has unfolded itself in the time it takes to draw a breath. The engine, sounding for all the world like an angry sewing machine, carries a single soldier away across the grass. It was never meant to win the war on its own. It was meant to buy minutes, the minutes between landing and regrouping, between isolation and purpose, between a man alone in a field and a man back with his unit. It was never meant to last. It was meant to work once when it mattered, and then to be left behind without a second thought. It was built in secret by men who were paid to think differently about war. It was manufactured by the thousand in an ordinary Birmingham factory better known, before and after, for bicycles, and it was dropped into some of the most dangerous places in occupied Europe, packed alongside the tools of sabotage and resistance in the hope that speed, even a motorcycle's worth of speed, might be the difference between success and capture. It was the smallest motorcycle Britain ever sent to war, built in a stately home by men who designed sabotage for a living, manufactured by the thousand in a Birmingham factory, and dropped from the sky in a cardboard tube alongside guns, explosives, and the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, might need to move just a little bit faster than the enemy expected. That was the Welbike. Small enough to carry under one arm, light enough to lift with one hand, and for a few desperate minutes on a handful of battlefields across occupied Europe, just fast enough to matter.